I never thought my own daughter would slam the door in my face when I had nowhere else to turn. I never imagined the man she married would look at me like I was garbage cluttering up his perfect life. But that's exactly what happened, and it nearly destroyed me. What they didn't know was that life had been keeping a secret for me, one that would turn their world completely upside down. Get ready, because what you're about to hear isn't just my story, it's proof that sometimes the people who hurt you the most end up regretting it for the rest of their lives. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories like this one. My name is Helen, and I'm 56 years old. Until 6 months ago, I thought I understood what family meant. I spent 32 years married to Robert, building a life in Lakewood, a quiet suburb outside Denver. Every Sunday dinner, every birthday party, every holiday tradition revolved around our daughter Sarah. She was our world, and I believed we were hers. When Robert died from a heart attack last spring, the ground beneath my feet disappeared. One morning he was drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, the next morning I was planning his funeral. The house felt enormous and empty without his voice calling from the garage or his terrible jokes during dinner. But I told myself I still had Sarah. I still had my little girl. The medical bills from Robert's final months ate through our savings faster than I could process. The house we'd worked so hard to pay off suddenly felt like a burden I couldn't carry alone. When Sarah and her husband Derek suggested I sell and stay with them temporarily, it seemed like the logical choice. They had a spare bedroom, and I could help with groceries and housework while I figured out my next steps. I should have seen the warning signs immediately. Derek barely acknowledged me when I moved in with my belongings packed into garbage bags and old suitcases. He'd grunt when I said good morning, change the channel when I was watching something, and make these little sighs whenever I asked simple questions about where things were kept. Sarah would smile apologetically and whisper that he was just stressed about work. I tried to make myself useful. I cooked their favorite meals, kept the house spotless, and stayed in my small room most evenings so they could have their space. When Derek complained that the grocery bill was getting expensive, I started buying my own food and keeping it separate. When he mentioned that the water bill seemed high, I began taking shorter showers and doing my laundry at the laundromat down the street. But nothing I did seemed to help. Derek's irritation with my presence grew more obvious each day. He'd roll his eyes when I spoke during dinner. He'd make comments about freeloaders when he thought I wasn't listening. Once, I heard him tell Sarah that having me there was like babysitting a grown woman who couldn't take care of herself. The worst part wasn't Derek's hostility. It was watching Sarah shrink into herself whenever tension filled the room. My confident, outspoken daughter became quiet and apologetic, always trying to smooth things over instead of standing up for what was right. She'd give me these looks that seemed to say, please just go along with it, instead of telling her husband to treat her mother with basic respect. 3 months into my stay, I overheard them arguing in their bedroom. Derek's voice carried through the thin walls as he complained about privacy, expenses, and feeling like a stranger in his own home. Sarah's responses were too quiet to hear clearly, but I caught fragments. She has nowhere else to go and just until she gets back on her feet. The argument ended with Derek storming out and Sarah crying softly behind their closed door. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, knowing I was the cause of problems in my daughter's marriage. But I also knew I had no alternatives. My job search had been unsuccessful. Apparently 56-year-old widows with gaps in their employment history weren't in high demand. My savings were nearly gone, and I had no other family to turn to. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late October. I had made pot roast, Derek's favorite, hoping to ease some of the tension that had been building all week. Sarah was scrolling through her phone while Derek drank beer and stared at the television. The silence felt thick and uncomfortable, but I kept hoping things would improve. Then Derek set down his beer and looked directly at me. Helen, we need to talk about your situation here. My heart started pounding. What do you mean? I mean this arrangement isn't working anymore. You've been here 3 months, and nothing has changed. You're not working, you're not contributing financially, and honestly, Sarah and I need our space back. I turned to Sarah, waiting for her to defend me or at least soften her husband's words. Instead, she kept staring at her phone screen. Sarah, I said quietly. She finally looked up, but wouldn't meet my eyes. Maybe it would be better if you found something more permanent. The words hit me like a physical blow. More permanent? Where am I supposed to go? Derek shrugged. There are apartments for rent, senior communities, subsidized housing. You're a grown woman. Figure it out. But I don't have enough money for a deposit, and my credit isn't good enough to qualify for most places. That's not our problem anymore, Derek said, his voice getting harder. We've helped as much as we can. You can't just live here indefinitely expecting us to take care of you. I looked at Sarah again, desperate for some sign that she disagreed with her husband's cold assessment. But she just nodded slightly and said, "It really would be better for everyone." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply stood up from the table, walked to my room, and began packing my few belongings back into the same bags I'd arrived with. They didn't offer to help. They didn't ask where I planned to go. Derek turned the television volume up, and Sarah disappeared into their bedroom. 20 minutes later, I stood outside their apartment building with 2 suitcases and a canvas bag containing everything I owned. The October air was cold, and I realized I didn't even have a car anymore. I'd sold it the previous month to help pay for groceries. Sarah didn't walk me out. Derek didn't say goodbye. I sat on the concrete steps outside their building for over an hour, trying to process what had just happened. My phone battery was dead, I had $37 in my wallet, and I had no idea where to spend the night. Cars passed by, their headlights cutting through the darkness, and I wondered if this was what it felt like to become invisible. Eventually, I called a taxi and asked the driver to take me to the cheapest motel he knew. The Riverside Inn looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, but it was $45 a night and they didn't ask questions. The room smelled like cigarettes and cleaning chemicals, and the heater made strange noises all night, but it was shelter. I lay on the thin mattress staring at water stains on the ceiling, trying to understand how I'd gone from being a beloved wife and mother to a burden my own daughter couldn't wait to discard. The silence in that little room felt heavier than the silence in Robert's empty house ever had. The next morning, I sent Sarah a text message, "I understand. I love you no matter what." She never replied. Days blended into weeks at the Riverside Inn. I applied for jobs at grocery stores, retail shops, and fast food restaurants, but nobody wanted to hire a middle-aged woman with no recent work experience. I tried to make my remaining money stretch by eating 1 meal a day and walking everywhere instead of taking buses. Sarah never called. She never texted. It was as if I had never existed in her life at all. One evening in November, as I was going through my belongings to see what else I could sell, I found something I'd forgotten I'd packed. At the bottom of my canvas bag was a small leather journal that had belonged to my mother. I hadn't looked at it since she died 15 years earlier, but something made me open it that night. My mother's handwriting was still clear and neat, just like I remembered from the notes she used to pack in my school lunches. The early entries were ordinary, weather observations, grocery lists, complaints about neighbors. But as I kept reading, the tone changed. She began writing about someone she called Jay, someone who visited when my father was at work, someone who brought her small gifts and made promises he couldn't keep. My hands started shaking as I read entry after entry describing a secret relationship that lasted for years. My mother wrote about feeling guilty but being unable to stop seeing this man who made her feel alive again. She wrote about the money he gave her when times were tight, always making her promise never to tell anyone where it came from. Then I found the entry that changed everything. Jay said he's made arrangements. If anything happens to him, there will be something for Helen. He can't acknowledge her officially, too dangerous for his reputation, but he promised me she'll be taken care of. He said his lawyer, Mr. Patterson, knows about the trust. He made me write down the name and address just in case. I read those words 5 times before they sank in. According to my mother's journal, my real father wasn't the man who raised me. It was someone called Jay, who had established some kind of trust fund in my name. And apparently, a lawyer named Patterson had information about it. I spent the next day at the public library using their computers to search for attorneys named Patterson in the Denver area. I found 3 possibilities, but only one had been practicing long enough to have known my mother 30 years ago. James Patterson, now retired but still listed with a small firm downtown. I used my last $20 to take a bus to his office. The receptionist told me Mr. Patterson only handled a few special cases now, but when I mentioned my mother's name, Dorothy Collins, her expression changed. She made a phone call, spoke quietly for a few minutes, then told me Mr. Patterson would see me immediately. James Patterson was a thin man in his 70s with kind eyes and gentle hands. When I walked into his office, he studied my face carefully and smiled. "You look just like her," he said. Dorothy was a lovely woman who found herself in an impossible situation. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a manila envelope with my name written on it in faded ink. "I've been waiting 30 years for you to walk through that door," he said. "Your mother made me promise to keep this safe until you needed it." Inside the envelope was a letter from someone named Jonathan Wheeler, the former owner of Wheeler Construction, one of the largest building companies in Colorado. In the letter, he admitted to having an affair with my mother and acknowledged that I was his daughter. He wrote about his regret at not being able to claim me publicly, but explained that he had established a trust fund to ensure I would be financially secure. Mr. Patterson handed me a folder containing bank statements, investment records, and property deeds. The trust fund had grown substantially over 3 decades. Between cash accounts and real estate holdings, I was looking at almost $2 million. I sat in that quiet office, surrounded by the smell of old books and legal documents, trying to process what this meant. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about where I would sleep that night or how I would pay for my next meal. I was thinking about Sarah and Derek, and how they had no idea that the woman they'd thrown away was about to become someone they couldn't ignore. Mr. Patterson walked me through the paperwork, explaining how to access the accounts and manage the properties. One of those properties particularly caught my attention, a small apartment complex in the same neighborhood where Sarah and Derek lived. It needed renovations, but it was structurally sound and could be profitable with the right improvements. That night, I checked out of the Riverside Inn and into a decent hotel near downtown Denver. I ordered room service for the first time in my life and took a long hot bath. But instead of celebrating, I found myself staring out the window and thinking about revenge. Not the loud, dramatic kind of revenge you see in movies. Something quieter and more permanent. Something that would teach them both what it felt like to be powerless and unwanted. Something that would show them exactly who they had discarded. I smiled as I drifted off to sleep, knowing that tomorrow I would begin planning the most important lesson of their lives. I spent the next 3 days sitting in my hotel room, staring at bank statements and property documents that still didn't feel real. Every few hours, I'd check the balances online just to make sure I hadn't imagined everything. The numbers were always the same, more money than I'd ever dreamed of having, and a small apartment building just 15 minutes from where Sarah and Derek lived. But I wasn't ready to act yet. Something inside me had changed permanently during those weeks at the Riverside Inn. The woman who used to beg Sarah to call her back was gone. The mother who would have forgiven anything just to be included again had disappeared somewhere between that cold October night and finding my mother's journal. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns hot and fades quickly. What I felt was colder and more patient. I felt like someone who had been underestimated her entire life and was finally ready to show people exactly what that mistake would cost them. I started by changing how I looked and where I lived. I found a furnished apartment downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the mountains. It was the kind of place Sarah would never imagine me being able to afford. I bought new clothes, not flashy or expensive, just well-fitted and professional. I got my hair cut shorter and started wearing it in a way that made me look confident instead of tired. When I looked in the mirror now, I saw someone different. Not the desperate woman who had packed her life into garbage bags, but someone who belonged in boardrooms and bank meetings. Someone who made decisions instead of begging for scraps of affection. The apartment building that caught my attention was called Riverside Gardens, though there was nothing garden-like about it. It was a tired-looking 3-story building with 24 units, built sometime in the 1980s and showing its age. The previous owner had fallen behind on property taxes and was selling to avoid foreclosure. According to the listing, most of the tenants were young professionals who paid their rent on time but complained constantly about maintenance issues. What made it perfect was the location. Sarah and Derek lived in Maple Court Apartments, just 6 blocks away. I could drive past their building on my way to check on my property. I could see Derek's beat-up truck in the parking lot and know exactly when he was home. I spent a week researching property management, tenant rights, and real estate law. I watched YouTube videos about renovation costs and hired contractors to inspect the building. Everything checked out. It was structurally sound but cosmetically worn down. With the right improvements, it could be both profitable and much more attractive than the building where Sarah and Derek were currently living. The purchase went through faster than I expected. I paid cash, which made the seller very happy and eliminated any chance of the deal falling through. I registered everything under a company name, Collins Property Holdings, that wouldn't immediately connect back to me. Within 2 weeks of walking into Mr. Patterson's office, I owned a piece of real estate 6 blocks from my daughter's front door. But I didn't rush into anything dramatic. I started small, visiting the building regularly to meet tenants and assess what needed to be done. I introduced myself as the new property manager working for the ownership company. Most people were polite but skeptical. They'd been disappointed by previous management and didn't expect much to change. I proved them wrong quickly. I hired a crew to fix leaky faucets, replace broken light fixtures, and repaint the lobby. I had new washers and dryers installed in the laundry room and upgraded the security system. Within a month, Riverside Gardens was starting to look like a place people would actually want to live. The improvements weren't just about making the building nice. They were about demonstrating something important, that I knew how to take care of people who deserved it. My tenants paid reasonable rent, followed the rules, and treated the property with respect. In return, they got a safe, clean place to live with a landlord who actually responded to their concerns. It was a stark contrast to what I'd heard about Maple Court Apartments, where Derek and Sarah lived. Through casual conversations with people in the neighborhood, I learned that their building was managed by a company that ignored maintenance requests, raised rent without making improvements, and generally treated tenants like annoyances rather than customers. That gave me an idea. I started driving past Maple Court regularly, not to spy on Sarah and Derek but to observe how the building was managed. The parking lot had potholes that never got fixed. The landscaping was overgrown and ugly. Broken light fixtures stayed broken for weeks. It was exactly the kind of property that frustrated tenants and made them dream of living somewhere better. 2 months after buying Riverside Gardens, I had it running smoothly enough to start phase 2 of my plan. I began researching Maple Court Apartments, learning who owned it, how it was financed, and whether the owners might be interested in selling. What I discovered was even better than I'd hoped. Maple Court was owned by a small investment group that had bought it 5 years earlier as part of a larger portfolio. They were having financial problems with several of their properties and were looking to sell some of them to raise cash quickly. I had my lawyer reach out to them through a third party, expressing interest in purchasing Maple Court on behalf of Collins Property Holdings. The initial response was positive. They were definitely willing to negotiate a sale. The asking price was higher than I wanted to pay, but well within my budget. More importantly, I knew I could improve the property significantly and make it profitable while still giving tenants a better place to live. Everyone would benefit from the sale except the current owners, who had been neglecting the building for years. While those negotiations were happening, I started watching Sarah and Derek more carefully. Not following them or anything that would be considered stalking, just paying attention to their routines when I happened to be in the neighborhood checking on my property. Derek left for work at the same time every morning, driving his dented pickup truck and usually looking angry about something. Sarah worked at a dental office downtown and took the bus because they only had one car. In the evenings, I could sometimes see them through their apartment window, Derek watching television while Sarah cleaned up after dinner or folded laundry. They looked tired. Not just physically tired, but emotionally worn down in a way that reminded me of how I'd felt during my final weeks living with them. Their relationship seemed tense, full of the kind of small irritations that build up when people are under financial stress. I found myself wondering if Sarah ever thought about me during those quiet evenings. If she ever felt guilty about how they treated me, or if she'd convinced herself that throwing me out had been the right thing to do. Part of me hoped she missed me. Another part of me hoped she didn't, because missing me would mean admitting she'd made a terrible mistake. 3 months after first contacting them, the owners of Maple Court accepted my offer. The sale would close in 60 days. after which Collins Property Holdings would own the building where my daughter and her husband lived. They would become my tenants without ever knowing it. I signed the papers in my lawyer's office on a grey December morning, using my mother's maiden name and wearing sunglasses so no one would remember my face clearly. When the final document was notarized, I owned 2 apartment buildings and had more money in the bank than Derek would earn in 10 years. But the most important part wasn't the money or the properties. It was the feeling of knowing that Sarah and Derek had no idea what was coming. They were still living their lives assuming they had control, making plans based on a reality that no longer existed. They were making decisions about someone they thought was powerless, not knowing that person now held their future in her hands. That night, I sat in my downtown apartment sipping wine and looking at the lights of the city below. For the first time since Robert died, I felt like myself again. Not the broken widow who had begged for a place to sleep, and not the desperate mother who would have done anything to earn her daughter's love. I felt like someone who mattered, someone who made things happen instead of waiting for things to happen to her. I also felt something else, a quiet, patient hunger for justice. Not revenge exactly, because revenge implies anger and I wasn't angry anymore. Justice meant letting people experience the consequences of their choices. It meant showing Derek what it felt like to be powerless in someone else's hands. It meant teaching Sarah that some mistakes carry a price that takes years to pay. The closing date for Maple Court was January 15th. I marked it on my calendar in red ink and began counting down the days. Soon, very soon, the people who had thrown me away like garbage would discover that garbage sometimes comes back. And when it did, it would be carrying a very expensive lesson about treating people with respect. I spent Christmas alone in my apartment, which should have made me sad but didn't. Instead, I felt calm and focused, like someone preparing for the most important performance of her life. I wondered what Sarah and Derek were doing for the holiday, whether they'd thought about inviting me or if they'd managed to forget I existed entirely. It didn't matter anymore. By the time next Christmas came around, everything would be different. They would understand exactly what they'd lost when they decided I wasn't worth keeping around. And I would finally have the peace that comes from knowing that nobody would ever underestimate me again. January 15th arrived with snow falling gently outside my apartment windows. I dressed carefully that morning, a dark blue suit that made me look professional and serious, the kind of outfit that commands respect in business meetings. When I signed the final papers making me the owner of Maple Court Apartments, I felt like I was signing a declaration of war. A quiet, calculated war that Derek and Sarah would never see coming. The previous owners had left behind detailed files on every tenant, including payment histories, lease agreements, and maintenance requests. I spent my first week as owner studying these documents like a general studying battle plans. Most of the tenants were decent people who paid their rent on time and didn't cause problems. A few were chronically late with payments or had damaged their units, but overall it was a manageable group. Then I came to the file labeled Unit 2B Derek and Sarah Morrison. Their rent was $1,200 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment. They'd never been late with a payment, never filed complaints, never caused any problems for management. According to their lease, they'd been model tenants for almost 3 years. Derek worked construction and made decent money when projects were available. Sarah's job at the dental office provided steady income and health insurance. On paper, they looked like exactly the kind of tenants any landlord would want to keep. But I wasn't just any landlord. I was the woman they'd thrown out into the cold because they couldn't be bothered to treat me like family. I started by changing the property management company. The previous owners had used a large firm that managed dozens of buildings and treated each property like just another number on a spreadsheet. I hired a smaller company that specialized in personal service and direct communication with tenants. The new managers would handle day-to-day operations while I made the important decisions about rent, renovations, and lease renewals. The first letter went out to all tenants in February, informing them that Maple Court had been sold to Collins Property Holdings and introducing the new management team. The letter also announced that rent increases would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis when leases came up for renewal, based on factors like payment history, property improvements, and current market rates. I made sure that letter was professional and reassuring. I wanted most tenants to feel good about the change in ownership. I wanted them to see that new management meant better maintenance, improved security, and a landlord who actually cared about providing quality housing. But Derek and Sarah's lease wasn't up for renewal until October. That gave me 8 months to improve the property, build relationships with other tenants, and plan exactly how I wanted to handle the couple in Unit 2B. I started with renovations. Not dramatic changes that would disrupt people's lives, but steady improvements that made the building more attractive and valuable. I had the exterior painted a warm cream color that looked modern but not flashy. The lobby got new furniture and better lighting. The laundry room was expanded and equipped with newer machines. I also improved security by installing cameras in common areas and upgrading the locks on all exterior doors. The parking lot was repaved and properly marked. Dead landscaping was replaced with plants that would look good year-round with minimal maintenance. Every improvement was carefully chosen to increase the property value while making current tenants happier. I wanted people to see that Collins Property Holdings was the kind of company that invested in its buildings instead of just collecting rent and ignoring problems. The changes didn't go unnoticed. Tenants started leaving positive reviews online about the improvements. Several people told the new management team they were planning to renew their leases instead of moving elsewhere. The building started attracting interest from prospective renters who had previously looked at other properties. All of this made me look like a responsible, caring landlord to everyone except the 2 people who mattered most. To Derek and Sarah, I was still completely invisible. They had no idea who owned their building now, or that the woman they'd discarded was watching their every move. I started driving past Maple Court more frequently, usually in the evenings when I knew they'd be home from work. Sometimes I'd park across the street and watch their apartment window, seeing shadows move behind thin curtains. Derek still left for work at the same time every morning, still drove the same beat-up truck. Sarah still took the bus downtown, still looked tired when she came home in the evenings. They seemed settled in their routine, comfortable in their assumption that nothing in their lives would change without their permission. Derek probably thought he was in control of his world, making decisions about who mattered and who didn't. Sarah probably told herself she'd made the right choice by supporting her husband instead of defending her mother. Neither of them understood that their comfortable assumptions were about to be shattered. In June, I decided it was time to start making my presence known in ways they wouldn't recognize. I began visiting Maple Court regularly, introducing myself to tenants as a representative of the ownership company. I wanted to be a familiar face around the building, someone people trusted and respected. Most tenants were happy to meet me. They appreciated having direct access to someone who could address their concerns instead of dealing with a faceless management company. I listened to their suggestions, fixed problems quickly, and generally proved that the new ownership was serious about maintaining high standards. Derek and Sarah were harder to approach. They kept to themselves, rarely participating in building social events or chatting with neighbors in the lobby. When I did encounter them in hallways or the parking lot, I made sure to look different enough that they wouldn't recognize me. I kept my hair styled differently than when I'd lived with them, wore professional clothes instead of the casual outfits they remembered, and always had business papers or a clipboard in my hands. The first time I spoke directly to Derek was in July. He was struggling to get a heavy box out of his truck when I happened to be walking past the parking lot. I offered to help, introducing myself as Helen Collins from the property management team. He looked at me suspiciously at first, probably wondering why someone in a business suit was hanging around the building. But when I explained that I was there to check on recent maintenance work, he relaxed and accepted my help with the box. "Thanks," he said as we carried it toward the building entrance. "Most landlords don't actually show up to see what's going on." "We're not like most landlords," I replied. "Collins Property Holdings believes in maintaining direct relationships with our tenants." He nodded approvingly. "Good to hear. The last company that owned this place didn't care about anything except collecting rent." We rode the elevator to the second floor together, making small talk about the building improvements and the upcoming summer heat. When we reached his door, Derek set down his end of the box and looked at me more carefully. For a moment, I thought he might recognize something familiar about my face or voice. My heart started beating faster as he studied my features, trying to place where he might have seen me before. Then Sarah opened the apartment door and the moment passed. Derek turned his attention to explaining that he'd gotten a good deal on a used air conditioning unit, and Sarah smiled politely at me before helping him carry the box inside. I stood in the hallway for a few seconds after their door closed, listening to their muffled voices discussing where to install the air conditioner. Sarah sounded tired but content, probably relieved that they'd found a way to stay cool during the hot months without spending too much money. Neither of them had any idea they'd just been talking to the woman whose life they'd destroyed 8 months earlier. Neither of them suspected that the helpful representative from Collins Property Holdings was actually Helen Morrison, the mother and mother-in-law they'd thrown away like broken furniture. That conversation gave me exactly what I needed, confirmation that they saw me as a completely different person now. The desperate, dependent woman who had begged them for shelter was gone, replaced by someone who belonged in their world as an equal. Someone who had authority and resources instead of just need and hope. Over the next few weeks, I had similar brief encounters with both of them. I helped Sarah carry groceries when her bus dropped her off during a rainstorm. I answered Derek's questions about when the parking lot would be resealed. I gradually became a familiar, trusted figure in their building, someone they respected without ever connecting to their past. August brought the first phase of my real plan into action. All tenants received letters informing them that lease renewals would begin being processed in September, with new rent amounts based on comprehensive market analysis and property improvements. The letters emphasized that Collins Property Holdings was committed to fair, transparent pricing that reflected the true value of living at Maple Court. Most tenants weren't worried. The building had improved significantly since the ownership change, and modest rent increases were expected in a growing market. Several people told me they'd be happy to pay a little more for the enhanced amenities and better management. But Derek and Sarah's situation was different. Their lease was the last one coming up for renewal, which meant I had more time to plan their specific terms. It also meant they'd have to wait longer than other tenants to learn what their new rent would be. I spent September watching them more carefully, noting small details about their routines and expenses. Derek's construction work had slowed down during the summer, which meant less income just when they'd be facing a potential rent increase. Sarah had been working extra hours at the dental office, probably trying to build up savings for whatever changes might be coming. They looked stressed in ways they hadn't before. I'd see them having intense conversations in their apartment, gestures animated and voices occasionally rising loud enough to hear through the walls. Money problems were clearly putting pressure on their relationship, just like they had when I'd been living with them. The difference was that this time, I was the one applying the pressure. This time, I was the one making decisions about their future instead of begging them to let me stay. October 1st was circled in red on my calendar. That was when Derek and Sarah would receive their lease renewal offer, and when they'd finally understand that their comfortable little world was no longer under their control. I spent the evening of September 30th in my downtown apartment, looking out at the city lights and thinking about justice. Tomorrow, the people who had taught me what it felt like to be powerless would begin learning that lesson themselves. And unlike them, I planned to be very patient about teaching it properly. The lease renewal letter went out on October 1st, delivered by certified mail to ensure there would be no confusion about when Derek and Sarah received it. I had spent weeks crafting the language, working with my lawyer to make sure everything was legally sound while still delivering the message I wanted them to receive. The new rent amount was $3,600 per month, exactly triple what they'd been paying. The letter explained that this increase reflected current market rates for renovated units in desirable neighborhoods, along with the substantial improvements made to the property over the past year. It was completely legal, properly documented, and absolutely devastating to their budget. I knew they couldn't afford it. Derek's construction income was inconsistent, and Sarah's dental office job paid decently but not enough to cover a rent increase of that magnitude. They would have 30 days to either accept the new terms or find somewhere else to live. 2 days after the letters were delivered, Derek called the management office demanding to speak with someone in authority. The property manager transferred the call to me, though Derek had no idea he was speaking directly to the owner of the building. "This rent increase is insane," he said, his voice tight with anger. $3,600 for a 2-bedroom apartment? That's highway robbery. "I understand your concern," I replied calmly. "However, the new rent reflects current market conditions and the significant improvements made to the property. Comparable units in this area rent for similar amounts. We've been model tenants for 3 years, Derek continued. Never late with rent, never caused problems. Doesn't that count for anything? Your tenancy record is noted in our files, I said. Unfortunately, market rates aren't determined by individual tenant history. They're based on property value and area demand. There was a long pause. I could hear Derek breathing heavily, probably trying to control his temper. Is there any room for negotiation here? Any way to work out a more reasonable increase? The terms in the renewal offer are final, I replied. You have until October 31st to decide whether to accept them or vacate the unit. Derek hung up without saying goodbye. That evening, I drove past their building and could see lights on in their apartment until well past midnight. They were probably sitting at their kitchen table with bills and bank statements spread out, trying to figure out if there was any way to make the numbers work. 3 days later, Sarah called. Her voice was softer than Derek's, more pleading than demanding. I'm calling about our lease renewal, she said. The rent increase is really going to put us in a difficult position. Is there any possibility of a payment plan or a smaller increase? I'm sorry, I told her. The new rent amount has been set based on extensive market analysis. Collins Property Holdings has invested significantly in improving this property, and the pricing reflects that investment. We really love living here, Sarah continued. This building has become home for us. Isn't there anything we can do to stay? For a moment, listening to my daughter beg to keep her housing, I felt something twist in my chest. Not sympathy, exactly, but recognition. She sounded exactly like I had when I was pleading with them to let me stay in their spare bedroom. The same desperation, the same hope that appealing to someone's better nature might change their mind. I understand this is disappointing, I said. But business decisions can't be based on personal sentiment. The rental market in this area has changed significantly over the past year. Sarah was quiet for several seconds. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more defeated. Could you at least tell me who owns the building? Maybe if I could speak with them directly. Collins Property Holdings values tenant privacy and handles all communications through our management team, I replied. I'm authorized to make decisions regarding lease terms. After Sarah hung up, I sat in my office staring at the phone. Part of me had expected to feel triumphant after those conversations, satisfied that Derek and Sarah were finally experiencing the powerlessness they'd forced on me. Instead, I felt hollow and strangely sad. But I didn't change my mind. Justice isn't supposed to feel good, it's supposed to feel necessary. Over the next 2 weeks, Derek and Sarah made several more attempts to negotiate. They offered to sign a longer lease in exchange for a smaller increase. They proposed paying additional security deposits. Derek even suggested doing maintenance work around the building in lieu of higher rent payments. I rejected every proposal politely but firmly. The terms were non-negotiable, and they had until the end of the month to decide. During this time, I continued my regular visits to Maple Court, observing how the stress was affecting them. Derek looked haggard and angry, snapping at other tenants and slamming doors louder than necessary. Sarah appeared tired and worried, checking apartment listings on her phone whenever she thought no one was watching. Their relationship was clearly suffering under the pressure. I could hear them arguing through their apartment walls during my evening visits to check on building maintenance. Derek's voice would rise in frustration while Sarah tried to calm him down, the same dynamic I'd witnessed when I lived with them, except now Derek's anger was focused on their landlord instead of his unwanted mother-in-law. On October 20th, something unexpected happened. Sarah approached me in the lobby while I was reviewing work orders with the maintenance supervisor. "Miss Collins," she said hesitantly, "could I speak with you for a moment?" I looked up from my clipboard, keeping my expression neutral. "Of course. What can I help you with?" "It's about our lease renewal," she said, glancing around to make sure no other tenants were listening. "I know you've said the terms aren't negotiable, but I was hoping you might reconsider if I explained our situation." I set down my clipboard and gave her my full attention. "I'm listening." Sarah took a deep breath. "My husband and I have been going through a really difficult time. We We had some family problems earlier this year. Financial issues, personal conflicts. Living here has been one of the few stable things in our lives. She paused, looking down at her hands. I know you probably hear stories like this all the time, and I'm not trying to make excuses. But this apartment is all we have right now. If we have to move, I don't know where we'll go or how we'll afford anything else. I studied her face carefully. She looked genuinely distressed, not just frustrated about money but emotionally exhausted in a way that went deeper than rent concerns. For the first time since this whole situation began, Sarah reminded me of the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when she was scared. I appreciate you sharing that with me, I said carefully. But I'm sure you understand that property management decisions can't be based on individual circumstances. We have to maintain consistent policies for all tenants. Sarah nodded slowly, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I understand. I just thought, maybe if you knew. She trailed off, probably realizing that her personal problems weren't going to change business reality. After a moment, she straightened her shoulders and looked directly at me. Can I ask you something? She said. Do you have children? The question caught me off guard. Yes, I replied without thinking. Then you might understand what it's like to make mistakes that hurt the people you love, Sarah continued. Sometimes you don't realize how wrong you were until it's too late to fix it. I felt my composure slipping slightly. I'm not sure I follow. My mother, Sarah said quietly. Earlier this year, when she needed help, I let my husband convince me to turn her away. I told myself it was the right thing to do, that it would be better for everyone. But it wasn't. It was cruel and selfish, and I've regretted it every single day since. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't even know where she is now or if she's okay. I tried calling her, but she never answered. I probably don't deserve forgiveness, but I'd give anything to make it right. I stood perfectly still, afraid that any movement might give away the storm of emotions building inside me. Sarah was confessing her guilt to the very person she'd wronged, not knowing that her mother was standing 3 feet away wearing a business suit and a false name. I'm sorry to hear about your family situation, I managed to say. But as I mentioned, personal circumstances can't influence business decisions. Sarah nodded and stepped back. I understand. Thank you for listening anyway. She walked toward the elevator, and I watched her press the button with trembling hands. As the doors opened, she turned back to me one last time. If you do have children, she said, make sure they know you love them unconditionally. Because losing that, it's worse than losing everything else. The elevator doors closed, and I was left standing in the lobby with my clipboard and my carefully maintained composure cracking around the edges. For the first time since I'd bought this building, I questioned whether what I was doing was justice or just another form of cruelty. But I didn't change the lease terms. Some lessons have to be learned the hard way, and some consequences can't be avoided just because people finally understand they were wrong. On October 31st, Derek and Sarah submitted their notice that they would be vacating Unit 2B. They'd found a smaller, cheaper apartment across town and would be moving out by the end of November. The letter was formal and polite, with no mention of their previous attempts to negotiate or the hardship the move would cause them. I approved their notice and began advertising their unit for rent at the new market rate. Within a week, I had 3 qualified applicants willing to pay $3,600 for a renovated 2-bedroom apartment in a well-managed building. The day Derek and Sarah moved out, I watched from my car across the street as they loaded their belongings into a rented truck. They worked efficiently but sadly, like people who'd been forced to abandon something important. Sarah kept looking back at the building, and Derek moved with the angry energy of someone who felt he'd been cheated. When they drove away for the last time, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. They'd learned what it felt like to be powerless in someone else's hands. They'd experienced the fear and uncertainty of having no control over their housing situation. But watching them leave didn't bring me the peace I'd expected. 3 months later, on a cold February evening, I received an unexpected phone call on my personal line. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, the first time she tried to contact me since those unanswered voicemails almost a year earlier. I let it ring 4 times before answering. Hello. Mom. Sarah's voice was tentative, like she wasn't sure I'd actually picked up. Are you there? I'm here, I said quietly. I found out, she said after a long pause. About Colin's property holdings. About you owning our building. My heart started racing, but I kept my voice steady. How? The property manager mentioned that Helen Collins had been very involved in tenant relations. It took me a while to put it together, but when I remembered you mentioning your mother's maiden name was Collins. Sarah took a shaky breath. You were there. All those times I called the office, all those conversations about the lease renewal. You were the one making the decisions. Yes, I said simply. Why didn't you tell me? When I was begging you to reconsider the rent increase, when I was explaining about our family problems. You knew exactly what I was talking about, didn't you? Yes, I repeated. Sarah was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. I deserved it, didn't I? Everything that happened. You were teaching me what it felt like. I was giving you consequences, I corrected. There's a difference. Derek and I separated last month, Sarah said suddenly. The stress of moving, the financial pressure, everything that happened. It broke us. He blamed me for not being able to fix things with the landlord. I blamed him for creating the situation in the first place. She paused. But really, we both knew the problem started with how we treated you. I listened to my daughter cry softly over the phone, and for the first time in months, I felt the hard shell I'd built around my heart begin to crack. I don't expect forgiveness, Sarah continued. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I needed you to know that I understand now. I understand what we took from you, and what it cost us both. Where are you living now? I asked. A studio apartment near my work. It's small, but it's all I need. I've been going to therapy, trying to figure out how I became someone who could hurt her own mother like that. We talked for another hour, carefully and honestly in a way we hadn't done in years. Sarah didn't ask for money or help or even forgiveness. She just wanted me to know that she finally understood the weight of what she'd done, and that she was trying to become someone worthy of the love I'd always given her. When we hung up, I sat in my downtown apartment looking out at the city lights and thinking about justice and mercy and the complicated mathematics of family love. I'd proven my point and protected my dignity, but I'd also learned that revenge, even quiet, legal revenge, doesn't heal the wounds that caused it. 2 weeks later, I sent Sarah a letter. Not as Colin's property holdings or through lawyers, just a mother writing to her daughter. I told her about finding my mother's diary, about discovering the inheritance, about the months I'd spent planning her consequences. I explained that I'd needed her to understand what powerlessness felt like, but that I was ready to start building something new between us. I also sent her a check, not charity, but payment for a consulting job I'd invented, helping Colin's property holdings develop tenant relations policies. It was enough to cover the security deposit on a better apartment, with a note explaining that everyone deserves a second chance to make better choices. Sarah called me the day she received the letter. We talked for 3 hours about guilt and forgiveness, about the difference between justice and mercy, and about how love sometimes requires letting people face the consequences of their actions before healing can begin. 6 months later, we had dinner together for the first time since that terrible October night when Derek threw me out. Sarah had moved to a nicer apartment and was rebuilding her life with the kind of intentional kindness that comes from understanding how much damage careless cruelty can cause. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. We didn't rush into easy forgiveness or false reconciliation. Instead, we began the slow, careful work of building a new relationship based on honesty and mutual respect rather than obligation and assumption. I kept Colin's property holdings and continued improving properties around Denver. But I also used my resources to fund a shelter for displaced families, particularly women who found themselves homeless after family betrayals. I called it the Dorothy Collins Center, after my mother, and made sure it provided not just shelter but the kind of support that helps people rebuild their dignity along with their lives. Sometimes the people who hurt us teach us exactly how strong we can become. And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very patient, they also learn to become worthy of the strength they helped us discover. The woman who got thrown out with 2 suitcases and a broken heart was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that true power comes not from controlling other people, but from never again allowing anyone to make you feel powerless. And that, I realized, was the most important lesson of all. Thank you for listening to my story. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one, and let me know in the comments what you think about second chances and whether some mistakes can ever truly be forgiven.